Great. Well, good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Courtney and Steve for giving me the opportunity to chair this panel on international norms and agreements. We'll try to have some time for questions towards the end of the panel, and I'd like to say a few words right now to frame the issue that we're going to focus on. I just want to note that I'm a recovering bureaucrat. Mike is an active lawyer, so we have two disreputable characters up here, and then we have Lady Sohair, who is an entrepreneur and a real visionary when it comes to looking at space from a different perspective. And what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about this whole issue of the norms and agreements, but take it from a different perspective. The first one is we'll focus on cislunar and lunar, so we're going to forget about everything in between. The second assumption, or kind of fundamental idea here, is that if you look at the evolution of the space enterprise since the beginning of the space age, everything has begun as a government monopoly. Telecommunications, space launch, human space flight, remote sensing. Eventually, governments either get bored with doing that, or they can't continue to fund it, or they conclude there's money to be made for the private sector, and it's all handed over to the private sector. But the private sector has to adjust its business plan to the architecture that was developed at the beginning of each of those enterprises. And that architecture may or may not be the one that they would have put into place if given the chance. So in the case of cislunar and lunar activities, if history repeats itself and eventually the commercial sector will take over those activities on a large scale, why don't we have a process for industry to be in on the basic construction of what that architecture might be? And it can take varying forms. One of them that Lady Sohair will talk about is the compact, and Mike will be giving us a perspective on Artemis, and I think probably some of his experiences in trying to do something new, like with Bigelow, and the impact that had on his thinking. The other part of this is the fact that we have two different visions for the moon. We have the Artemis Accords, we have what China's trying to do. The question that I've asked is, what happens if you don't want to be part of either one of those? And how are your interests going to be taken into account? If you want to be on the moon, but you aren't part of those two programs and you want to do something else. And how is that all going to be, all of that, how will that all fit together beyond the need for, at some point, the US and China to talk about what they're going to be doing up there at an intergovernmental level. And then finally, in terms of norm building and norms of behavior and those sorts of things, in my own view, Article 6, the authorization and supervision is the key, because every state that's party to the Outer Space Treaty can authorize and supervise its nationals any way they want, and they don't have to get the permission of anyone else. So you could have 100 different norms of behavior for any given activity. And authorization and supervision can either make you or break you if you're a commercial entity. And how do we balance that? If you need the government's authorization to go into space, they can tell you they like what you're doing or they don't like what you're doing. You really kind of have to take that into account. And that is really key, because any one nation can set its own way of doing business in space, but it has absolutely no impact on the rest of the world unless they either have some kind of bilateral or multilateral understanding. And that is to be determined how that will occur. So with those kind of basic observations on my part, what I'd like to do is ask Lady Sohair to talk a little bit about the compact, the role of civil society. What we've tried to do with the compact is take a different approach, which is why isn't civil society taking responsibility for how we behave in space when civil society and the commercial sector has kind of the most at stake in many respects. So I'll hand that over to Lady Sohair. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. So first of all, I want to thank Beyond Earth Institute for having us today and for providing the opportunity of talking with all of you, great members from the space industry, Courtney and Steve. Thank you very much. And I have always to say how much I'm honored and lucky, so lucky to be working with those two gentlemen, Mike and Ken, who work with me side by side to implement the Washington Compact, which actually now having more than or over 100 signatories from all over the world just in 1 year. So thank you again for working with me always on this. So I have to say that there is no better time than this time and these days to speak about space and space diplomacy with all these conflicts going around the world and with the fact that space advancement or technology advancement was, for example, in the Cold War, one of the most important reason or element to end conflicts around the world. So technology advancement and space diplomacy is a great need when we have always conflicts. So the Washington Compact actually is providing the norms of behavior for the commercial space industry, for the private industry, which is the main driver for the space in these days and for the technology. And we wanted to make sure that we provide a platform for the space industry to work together in implementing the best norms of behavior, best practice, best principles of making this for the better future of humanity, for the better future even for their business. Actually coming from a background of being an entrepreneur and businesswoman working in different continents for a long time in my life, I truly understand that we all can work together. We can have one goal, that we can share value, we can share principles. I have been talking to companies, to commercial companies and entities from India to Japan. We have been talking with companies from China, from Europe, from everywhere around the world. They all have the same goals. They all have the same values. It's just how we can bring them all together under one platform or in one platform. So the Washington Compact now actually is providing this platform. I'm so happy that we have introduced those norms of behavior for the commercial space industry. I am not from the space industry. I have never worked in the space industry, in fact. And Mike and Ken really helped me to understand how we can help this industry to move forward in better future. But what I understand, that we can all work together, we can all have one goal, and we can all implement the good norms of behavior, a good practice for this industry to move forward. So now we have really those great signatories, many of you here in the room among our signatories, and I really appreciate and thank you very much for trusting us, trusting our works. But we will keep working, and we will continue reaching out and seeking for more people and more members and more commercial entities to come on board with us on this great work that was introduced to the industry. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
So really appreciate, Lady Sohair, your vision, your leadership, because as you said, space has never been more important than it is now. At this time of conflict in the Middle East, space is something that overcomes the barriers. It means nothing, but it's literally what connects us together, space. And as I'm particularly proud to see what's happened to the Washington Compact and with the Artemis Accords, where United Arab Emirates was a founding member, we have Saudi Arabia, we have Israel, all standing together. I think space is just unique in uniting us as people, as humanity. So just really appreciate what you've done, Ken, and I'm very grateful for an opportunity to talk about Bigelow Aerospace. I don't get to talk about my Bigelow days too much. And, Courtney, Ken, Jim, you all remember me from my Bigelow days, so I'm glad to get to say a word or two on that. For those of you who don't remember, Robert Bigelow, entrepreneur who established Bigelow Aerospace, was developing inflatable space habitats, a technology that's compacted in orbit and then expands out. We were on the commercial space station concept before it was cool, and we were trying to develop it back in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, and that's where I really got my first real taste of space policy and what the challenges were and what the opportunities were. And part of the reason that I had that opportunity was we were launching expandable habitat prototypes with an entity called ISC Kosmotros, which was a joint Russian-Ukrainian effort, taking the SS-18, designated Satan by NATO, removing the warhead, putting on a commercial fairing, and using it for commercial space launch. Literally a swords into plowshares program. And that's why I was so excited that we were taking a weapon of war and turning it into a tool for peaceful commerce. And the prices were right, that because it was a nuclear missile, the rocket had already been built, so it was cheap just to put on a commercial fairing, get rid of the warhead, and proceed. And despite all the challenges and conflict that we have in the world today, the fact that I was on a Russian nuclear missile base, and this is the other fun part, that we were going to launch out of Baikonur, and then one day the Russians came to me and said, "How would you like to launch from the Yasny Space and Missile Complex?" And I said, "That's great. What the hell is the Yasny Space and Missile Complex?" Because I knew all the launch bases, and that wasn't one of them. Turns out Yasny was an active strategic nuclear rocket forces base by the Russians. The idea was you got a Russian nuclear missile, let's just launch it from a nuclear missile silo. And as opposed to Baikonur, where it could take hours to get from the hotel to your launch facility, here they carved out an area on the military base, built a hotel and an assembly integration test building connected together so we could literally roll out of bed and go work on our spacecraft. So it was attractive from a time and money perspective. We called the hotel the Ritz-Carlton of Yasny. And this is Yasny, Siberia. Everyone says, this is in Siberia. Literally, my friends would be like, the only person who goes to Siberia knows when you're coming back. And I'm like, you obviously haven't been on a launch campaign because you never know when you're coming back. So we went out, and as you might imagine, there are some pretty extraordinary export control issues when you're trying to launch a Russian nuclear missile base. And it would be when we'd have technical meetings in Moscow, myself, handful of our engineers across the table, a dozen card-carrying members of the Communist Party. But if you brought a third-party observer into the room and told them to identify which is the free country and which is the post-communist dictatorship, or whatever we want to call Russia, they would have pointed to the Russians as the free country, because we were traveling with not one, but two DITSA monitors, Defense Technology Security Administration monitors, breathing down our neck, telling us everything we could or couldn't say. And then to boot, I was paying for the privilege, that we were paying $150 per hour, per monitor, plus room and board, plus overtime. Bigelow Aerospace dropped $300,000, $400,000 direct fees to the government alone, millions on compliance. I would joke with the Russians that the KGB may have spied on you back in the day, but at least they had the good courtesy to do it for free. I'm paying for my own government spying. And it would have been one thing if we had technologies that needed to be vigorously defended. It's not export controls I have a problem with, it's the overbreadth of export controls that I take issue with. An example of this, we had the tech stand, which was poorly named, and it was a round metal thing with 4 legs sticking out, and its sole purpose was to keep the spacecraft from laying on the ground. That's all it was. If you flipped it upside down, tablecloth, some nice cutlery, indistinguishable from a metal coffee table, indistinguishable. I had to have 2 guards watching the coffee table and then 2 DITSA monitors watching the guards watch the coffee table. And I can only imagine the national security repercussions of this table technology leaking out, where the Russians or, God forbid, the Iranians could have used it to serve coffee, or in a worst case scenario, even tea. So when it comes to these policy issues, and again, I can laugh about it now, right? But it was devastating. Again, we spent millions. Courtney, you were part of this. And while we had the resources to tackle export control, smaller companies wouldn't. And to this day, export control remains a drag. And what also remained a drag was Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, our favorite article of the Outer Space Treaty. So, I mean, I was much younger, when Ken Hodgkins said, what we need to think about, Mike, is, Ken was the first person to raise Article 6 with me as a problem because Ken wanted the private sector to succeed. He didn't want to have to say no. And I remember walking into the FAAST way back in the day and going to Patty Grace Smith. How many people remember the late, great Patty Grace Smith, wonderful person. And I asked her, I said, Patty, who has regulatory control over commercial space stations? And she was like, no one. And the sad part is, if I were to ask that question today, 20 years later, the answer has not changed. So I know we're supposed to go cislunar, and obviously Article 6 is a huge impact on cislunar. And for anyone who doesn't know Article 6, first, you live the wonderful life. It's the, as we mentioned, authorization and continuing supervision of private sector space activities by the government. We need to get this right. Now, it's not a gap. We do have government agencies that do this, but we don't have an agency explicitly identified. We need a simple, transparent, hands-off process that allows innovation to flourish. So that was just back at Bigelow Aerospace. We're dealing with export control, dealing with Article 6. A lot more I could say there. And we're still dealing with those issues, so they have yet to come. And finally, I'll just end on the Artemis Accords. The Accords were a beginning of the conversation, not an ending. The Accords focus on civil space activities. What we weren't able to cover were commercial activities and national security activities. Additionally, due to geopolitics, the Chinese have not signed the Artemis Accords, so they're welcome to. I hope that they do. And this is why I was so appreciative of the work that was done with the Washington Compact, because the Compact dealt with many commercial signatories, and also Chinese entities has signed. I would say Indian entities have signed, unlike the Accords, but India signed the Accords, so thank you, India. I think there might even be further expansion of the Accords today. We'll see what is going to have to happen. Problem with the Accords right now is we're at 29 members, so when I put that chart up, it just looks like there's one missing from the full 30, so I'm looking forward to add that. And additionally, the scope of the Washington Compact, that the Accords exclusively deal with beyond Earth orbit, and the fact that the Washington Compact then brings that down is terrific and deals with these issues. And look, obviously I'm biased, as I wouldn't say an active attorney, I'm a recovering attorney, but the engineers have the easy job, right? I have full faith we'll get the technology to work. Export control, Congress, there's no rocket equation for Congress. So it's the policy issues, it's the legal, it's the financial that, in my opinion, have held back the industry, and these are going to be some of the most intransigent issues that we need to overcome. But as I look out this room, the wonderful people, the old friends who have done so much, I see Melanie Saunders, who used to be with me at NASA, and we talk about the Accords. We stood on the shoulders of giants, of Melanie and people who did the Intergovernmental Agreement, the ISS. Jim Muncie has been fighting forever on these issues, and I'm leaving everybody out, but lots of people. But thank you again, everyone. Look forward to discussing these issues further, and thank you, Sohair, for your leadership, and Ken, everything that you've done for us.
Well, thank you. There was some method to my madness by mentioning Bigelow, which I knew would set off Mike, and I wasn't quite sure of how high and how far, but it's illustrative of the point we're going to get back to, is this whole notion of norms. And this is why I'll ask you both to comment again on what I'm going to say. We're looking at creating norms of behavior, but the question is, does the space enterprise wait for the norms to be created, or does the space enterprise create the norms? Because you have a big gap between the technological development and where things are going, and the ability to set standards through authorization and supervision at the national level, and to have overall norms of behavior in space at the international level. And all of these things that you were talking about, Mike, with Bigelow and export control, all those things, those might be kind of U.S.-centric, but it gets to the larger point of how a government's going to behave, and does the private sector have to take the reins and say, these are the things that we need in order to succeed. And I come back to that whole notion of, who is going to set those rules for the moon? If you aren't part of Artemis, if you aren't part of the Chinese activity, but you still want to operate up there, and you still want to get investors today for an investment that might not pay off for 10 or 20 years, how do you get that authorization and continuing supervision? Do you have to wait for the government to decide how they want to do this? Or is there some way of pressing the issue, moving forward, and having some kind of rulemaking or some kind of discussion over a long period of time within civil society on what makes sense, and how are we going to make money? How are we going to do the things that we want to do in lunar and cislunar activities? And I think for Sohair as an entrepreneur working globally, that even though it's not space, those issues still also have an impact. And I think that's where it's illuminating for us in terms of what you were seeking to do, not only at a business level, but also through the Hague Institute itself and its broader mandate. And so perhaps you could, each of you, take a few minutes and address that, and then we probably could move to a couple of questions.
Yeah, so public-private partnerships got us to where we are today. And the public-private partnerships are important not only for tech development and programs, but for policy. And I think we've been slower with that. The second golden age of space that we're in right now are due to public-private partnerships. We need the private sector to engage more in the policy debate, in policy development. The challenge that we've got is the international and domestic structures were not set up to accommodate the robust private sector participation. And that's why what Sohair's done, the Washington Compact, the Hague International Space Resources Governance Ruling Group, the GEGSLA, et cetera, all the NGOs, I think, are going to play a really important role, as the Hague and Washington Compact already is, because while COPUOS is wonderful, the United Nations is important, it's not structured to do that. So it's very important, I believe, for the private sector to engage early to address the policy issues that need to be addressed and to ensure that we do not regulate the industry to death. Good regulation comes from good experience. And if we start regulating before we have that experience, that's a recipe for disaster for both government and the private sector. So I think it's a combination. As an attorney, I have to always answer every question, both, right? Mm-hmm. That we do need to set norms behavior, and that's why I like what the Washington Compact was done, the Artemis Accords. They establish principles. They're not prescriptive in terms of what happens, and I think that's the level we need to remain with much of this, while getting into details where we can as experience dictates. And relative to Article 6, I'll also say that I think it's a good thing that different countries can implement Article 6 in different ways. In many ways, the world is a research lab of experiments in terms of how we do that, and then we can learn from each country. And finally, I left out one very important person, my thank yous. Without Bahavia Law, there wouldn't be an Artemis program. And I want to have a round of applause for Bahavia Law and the work that she did at NASA, recently left. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Mike. First of all, I have to say the same for Bahavia, and it's really a pleasure to seeing you again. But I truly agree with you. I believe that the space industry is mature enough, especially the commercial and the private sector. It's really mature enough now to move on to the policy and to the regulation and to do their the role of implementing, working side by side with the governments on making this industry better for future. So I think that, again, with the Washington Compact, we set principles, and it seems, at least until today, that the whole international community, and we have here all the embassies representatives, and I have almost talked to every one of you, and really nice and pleasure seeing you again. But it seems that the international community, up to date, they all agree on those principles and standards and norms of behavior, because when we talk to every single entity from around the world, we have been talking to maybe hundreds of companies and entities and governments and public departments from all over the world. And for almost 1 year, I can tell you that I am not from space industry, but I was hearing the same from everyone. What should we do? How we should implement? How we should work together? How we can compete, as Steve said, how we can be a competitor, but also work together on making this industry better for future and for humanity as well. So we need to keep working together. And I have to say again, I said this in our integration just a few months again when we integrated the Washington Compact. I said that I believe that the United States here, and again, as Mike said, you sent technology to space. You did that, and you worked hard. Now, it's really the need for sending the norms of behavior to space. So that's what I believe of, and that's why it's really a pleasure to be speaking from here, from this industry to the whole world. So we will keep working together, making sure that we implement those norms of behavior and the space diplomacy as well, with the Washington Compact, for sure the Artemis Accord, and I'm so happy that we work with Mike, who actually worked on the Artemis Accord, and now with the Washington Compact, which actually sets all those principles, not for governments only, but also for the commercial space industry. So that's what we will be working on for the future and for the coming few years and few months.
Great. Okay, so we'll open up for questions. We have about 7 minutes. If there are some questions from the floor, we'd really love to answer. And we have somebody with a microphone, so if you could wait for the microphone to arrive.
Hello. Hi, my name is Justin. You all briefly talked about how different countries are interpreting and applying Article 6 in their own ways. And I was wondering how tenable you think it is, either legally or practically, that the United States could move to a regulatory structure which acts more on a presumption of approval that can be revoked instead of having to apply for effectively anything you do in space. And just what your thoughts would be on that kind of a regulatory structure.
Mike, did you plant that? Checks in the mail. I guess it's a mission patch afterward. I love the way you're thinking. Again, recovering attorney. I believe in innocent until proven guilty. And too much of the regulatory structure assumes guilt. It goes from a place that you're a bad actor, particularly for our international friends. I despise the way that export control assumes almost bad action. So I think that is a vital part of not just Article 6, but of an evolution of regulatory perspective. So I appreciate that. I will say that Redwire and many other companies have been having conversations on Capitol Hill, and I hope that your and my dreams will be realized in the not too distant future in draft legislation.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to add to that. I worked at the State Department. I didn't have to, we weren't regulating anything, but we did have to pass judgment on new things that were coming in that didn't fall within the 3 regulatory regimes that currently exist, FCC, FAA, and NOAA. And from my perspective, the inability, as Mike mentioned, who is going to authorize and supervise a privately owned space station is a huge problem, because if internationally they see that the US doesn't have a way of doing that, then the first inclination is, well, we need a new treaty to take care of it. And then the second part is, a company comes in and says, I want to mine platinum on an asteroid and bring it back. Can I do it? And there are only three answers. The first one is yes, of course you can. The second one is no, and then they'd say, hey, how do you fix it? But the third and the worst answer is, I just don't know. And how do you build a business plan on that? And that is, it's not so much unpredictability, it's the uncertainty that we've injected into the system, not only nationally, but also internationally. And we have another question here.
Yeah, I want to ask, this go on automatically? Yeah. Since you're not on the federal payroll, let me ask a provocative question. As we sit here today, we've been waiting for the administration to come out with its mission authorization. We're told that an executive order is in draft. We're told there's a statute that's been drafted. All three of you spend a lot of time in the international space community. To what extent are we leaving a vacuum, a void, as each day, each month passes without the administration, without the Congress being proactive in this area?
Yeah, and before I answer, I think Courtney deserves a round of applause for all the incredible work he did in the early days, believing commercial space before it was cool. Thank you, Courtney, for your leadership. What I worry about there, Courtney, in the vacuum is a repeat of export control, because I've been to this movie before. So Sherman set the Wayback Machine for the 80s, and if you get that reference, you're old like me. We had a fairly relatively liberal export control policy. Then there was an accident involving Space Systems Loral before I was there with China, and Congress overreacted. They do what Congress does, they overreact to a crisis. And we had a draconian, counterproductive export control policy that actually did more harm to America than any other country. The reason I'm so concerned about Article 6 is not only Ken Hodgkins told me to be 15 years ago, but if there is an accident of some sort in space, satellite servicing, a CLIPS mission, a PAM mission, that then results in really negative repercussions, Congress could act. And we never create good policy from crisis. And we could end up with a system that's not good for government, not good for private sector. I mean, with export control, America went from being number one in commercial space launch to having only one commercial space launch. So I want us to get a well thought out, smart, efficient, transparent, effective, presumed approval process in place now, so that we can be prepared from a policy perspective and preempt before that accident happens.
Yeah, Sohair.
Got one more over here.
Oh, no, so I'd like you, Sohair, to.
So I can't really comment on the Article 6 because
You've led a better life than me, Sohair.
Yeah.
So you know.
Yeah, but again, what I can say is that from an international perspective, whatever is implemented here in this country as the country that really introduced this technology to the whole world and was a leading and is still the leading country in space industry, whatever is implemented will be helping the whole international community. So I hope, I'm not going to go into this, I think Mike already did, but what I hope that the work would be going on, and if anything that we can also do and work on it with this particular issue, we will be more than happy as well to work with our signatories, with our members who are really great signatories from all over the world to look at it.
Thank you.
One more question?
Yeah, so this is Robert Brose from Space Force. I thought both of the speakers offered a very hopeful vision of international space industry and enterprise and cooperation. Ms. Salam, sorry, you talked about how everybody wants the same thing. I think most people want some of the same things. I'm not sure everybody wants the same thing on every particular variable. And Mr. Gold, you talked about despising export control and you know, but the benefits of the U.S. having a bigger international role. But I will say I look on the website of Redwire and I don't see your email or your phone number or actually anyone's email. You have to go in and give your information to submit, as many websites do. But it's almost as if you're presuming that there's a bunch of people out there on the internet who might make mischief. I think that's a valid presumption. But so when you're looking at processes that are managing risk, that are defaulting to looking at the threat or the risk, as opposed to presuming the best intent, how do you, either of you, think that the judgments should be made? What considerations should be made, and what techniques do you use to make judgments about whether the balance should be tipped toward open cooperation or protecting against adverse outcomes?
So I don't think it's an either or in this case. It's a yes and. You know, the Ukrainian war, I think, was a wake-up call for a lot of us, that we ignore autocrats at our peril. And when it comes to China and what's occurring with Taiwan, we have to be extraordinarily cautious. You know, all of our values of freedom, liberty, diversity, inclusivity, we must defend and defend vigorously. And China represents an existential threat to that. At the same time, we need to be able to walk and chew gum. And this is why I think space plays such an important role, because it is one of the few, if not the only area where countries that are caught up in an existential threat, an existential change like this, can still talk. And I believe talking is important. I've based a life and a career on it. So when it comes for the Chinese, for example, I don't think you balance one way or the other. You ensure that the free world has space technology to be able to protect itself and protect our freedoms, protect the rule of law. At the same time, what Sohair has been saying, what Lady Sohair has done, you know, is extraordinary, and she has discovered there is so much common ground. There is more common ground in space than there is differences, by far. And when that is the case, we should seize that opportunity to find ways to bring adversaries together in the arenas where we can and where there's benefit to us both. And I think all nations benefit from a unified space policy. So I'm a Star Trek fan. So I am always going to be optimistic about humanity's future, and I think space and space technology represents that path. I'd like to think I'm realistic relative to the threats that we face as a species, but when there's an opportunity to reach out the hand in space policy, we must do so. And whether it's the Accords or the Washington Compact, I appreciate the leadership, the vision, the belief, and the optimism that will create a better world for all of us tomorrow.
I think you asked about challenges are not the same, or if I'm not mistaken, but I have to tell you that, as I said, we have been talking to hundreds of companies and members from the industries from all over the continent, you name it, from different countries, from countries who even don't have space office in their governments, and countries who are very mature now in this industry. And I can tell you that the challenges, the needs, if you really summarize them, it's at the end, they are the same. We want to work together, we want to collaborate, we want to have a safe future. The Hague Institute for Global Justice pillars, actually, rule of law, global governance, and conflict preventions. And I can see this in every discussion I had with members from this industry. Either they want to prevent conflict, or they want to implement rule of law, or they want to have the governance in their industry. So it's the same. Those are the same requirements for wherever you are around the world. It's the same for people, for governments, for industries as well. So that's when we say that we see the same challenges, the same requirements, that may be what we mean with that. So I hope I answer your question.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Mike and Lady Sohair, for joining me, and thank you to Beyond Earth Institute.